Enterprise security has undergone a mammoth sea change over the past few decades, brought on by rising technology. Advances such as new mobile devices, cloud computing, artificial intelligence, and the Internet of Things, just to name a few. CIOs and security specialists have been under enormous pressure to keep their networks, data, and assets safe and secure in this increasingly sophisticated threat landscape. It's critical that professionals stay on top of new security scenarios to counter the threats of today's hackers, criminals, and cyber terrorists. By viewing this report, IT and business professionals will be better prepared to cope with the security risks and challenges that come along with today's complex and rapidly evolving enterprise security environment. This program features expert Ron Temske, Vice President of Security Solutions for Logicalis US. Ron is responsible for defining Logicalis's strategic vision for security solutions and ensuring that consistent methodologies and procedures are applied nationwide. There are several teaching points in this program. First, we'll review the key security concepts that professionals need to recognize and comprehend. Next, a discussion about the difference between a risk-centric and a threat-centric approach to security. Then, we'll learn about the elements that are often missed with risk management programs and processes. In our concluding segment, expert Ron Temske offers his top 10 action items to improve your enterprise security. Now, let's begin our report. As stated in the opening of our report, the enterprise security landscape has undergone radical changes that IT and business professionals continue to grapple with. The good news is that though challenges still abound, more and more organizations seem to be getting the message that keeping pace with security in this hyper-connected world is a business imperative. In fact, IDG's 2017 Global State of Information Security Survey offered some positive news on how businesses are now implementing a modern approach to threat management and information sharing. Here are the key findings direct from IDG. Organizations are prioritizing their spending on security initiatives that align with the evolving digital ecosystems. Internet of Things, also known as IoT, is a growing investment area, and practices to secure the additional data and reduce vulnerabilities on interconnectivity are key safeguards being adopted. Data is being used to understand potential threats, provide security warnings, and more by 40% of organizations currently, with an additional 25% planning to adopt this year. Managed services is a key tool in the fight against cybercrime. Organizations rely on managed security services for highly technical initiatives, such as authentication, data loss prevention, and identity management. With that survey data in mind, let's turn now to our interview guest, Ron Temske, Vice President of Security Solutions for Logicalis. Ron begins the interview by outlining the key security concepts that IT and business professionals need to know and understand.
What we're going to talk about is the difference between a risk-centric and a threat-centric approach to security, and why I actually feel you need both. But before we do that, just some high-level things to consider. First is that security is ultimately about risk, right? It's about reducing the impact or negative business impact on an organization. And this is a little different than how we normally think of IT, which is just providing a technical function. So it's a little different way of looking at things. And at a high level, these are very old concepts, certainly known to those in security, but worth repeating. There are kind of three areas we look at from security, commonly called the CIA, or confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And so when we're evaluating security, we really need to think about our business assets and how those three principles relate to them. And it's important to understand that we think of assets as things that are physical, but of course they can be data, they can be intellectual property, even can be things like our brand or our reputation in the market is an asset for consideration under security. And so when we look at those three, I'll just take them in order. So first is confidentiality. We're looking at, do I have information or things that if disclosed without permission could cause harm to either my organization or perhaps customers in my organization? There are many examples in healthcare. Certainly a patient record is confidential, and in fact there are fines for disclosure of it. A financial organization, if you're publicly traded, before your earnings announcement is made, if that were released early, could certainly cause tremendous harm and in fact, contribute to insider trading. Those are examples under confidentiality. Taking the same approach with integrity, let's use those two examples again. patient record, if the integrity were modified, imagine that I have a deathly illness to penicillin and my record were compromised to remove that, right? It's pretty easy to think about the consequences that could produce. Using our financial example again, once my earnings announcement has been made, I'm not worried about confidentiality anymore, so that concern has gone away. But imagine if I announced 50 cents earning per share and the integrity was modified so it said 5 cents instead, right? That could have devastating impact on my stock price and the value of my organization. And then lastly is availability. And well, for years we've thought of that more in the realm of storage and systems and maybe didn't think about it as a security consideration. From a business perspective, do I really care whether I can't access my data, my applications, because a storage array has failed or I've suffered a distributed denial of service attack? From a business perspective, the end result is the same. My business is down, I can't generate revenue, I can't serve my customers. The reason is somewhat irrelevant to me. And so those are the concepts that we look at in security when we think about how do we apply security to a business.
According to Temske, security is not a product, it's a process. He strongly feels that to be effective, security must be well integrated into an organization's people, processes, and technology.
The idea of people, process, and technology is an old one and applied to many areas besides just security, but it really is applicable here. And too often we see folks looking at security just from the technology, just from the tools perspective. And what we lose by doing that is the people and process side, and some specific examples. So on the people side, human beings are the weak link in many security organizations. We keep clicking on phishing emails. We are susceptible to social engineering attacks. So we have to look at that people side, both from the victim, for lack of a better word, in an education, but also from the people as far as looking at the business and understanding it. And process, certainly, we see far too often, we'll go into a organization and look at the rules that they've applied across their security tools, and very commonly they're rules that don't align to policy or policies that don't have rules to actually enforce them. And if we think about it in kind of everyday term, it's like they either have police but without the laws that guide the police, or they have the laws but no police to enforce them, and you need both.
Expert Ron Temske is an advocate of a risk-based approach to security that utilizes information security frameworks such as CIS, NIST, ISO, and HITRUST. These are proven methodologies that provide a framework for managing risk throughout an IT environment in a highly cost-effective manner. Listen now as Temske defines a risk-based approach to security and discusses how it differs from a compliance-based approach.
One of the things we see is a misunderstanding that compliance equals security. And what causes that is many compliance and regulatory measures do in fact have security requirements as a part of them. So there's certainly a relationship between the two, but they're not one and the same. And there's two principal reasons for that. One is that the security within a compliance measure is specifically looking at the security as it relates to the items in that compliance, which may not be everything you need to look at. And number two is that many compliance measures are looking at a subset of an organization. So they may have good security measures for that subset, they're not taking the organization holistically. And in fact, as any of our customers who've gone through regulatory or compliance measures know, the first thing you do is reduce the scope of that compliance as much as you can to save on cost and effort in being compliant. So a risk-centric approach takes a look at an organization holistically, and rather than looking at tools, it looks at the business and says, what are my assets in the business and what is the value of those, and ensures that I'm actually looking at security for its primary purpose, which is protecting my business, not about just deploying technology for technology's sake.
Managing organizational risk is a key part of any enterprise security program. As mentioned earlier, there are several risk management frameworks available that are well suited for any number of verticals and businesses. They're provided by standards organizations like NIST and ISO. Here, Ron Temske talks about frameworks, how they can improve enterprise security, and how IT professionals should utilize them.
So the idea of a framework is it's really a blueprint, and what it helps address is the question we get so often of where do I even start, right? The security is so broad and so dynamic that it can be a little daunting to even know where to begin and where to prioritize, and a framework is designed to help with that. And as you mentioned, there are many of them out there, CIS, NIST, ISO, high trust. Some are not vertically specific. A few are. Examples would be high trust, which was specifically created to serve the medical industry. And the idea, or how to leverage these properly, is to remember that they are a blueprint. One of the objections we hear is, I think, folks using them incorrectly, that they look at them as checkboxes. And so they're just trying to check the box and not really thinking about the concepts behind it. Or number two, saying, well, control number 17 doesn't really apply to me, so I can't use this framework. Well, if control number 17 doesn't apply to you, then don't use it. But the framework itself still has value, and it really helps with that. And so we're big fans of frameworks and try to guide our customers in that realm. And I'll take it a step further in that if you're unsure where to start and you haven't looked at a framework, we particularly like the CIS 20 because it's approachable. Some of the other frameworks are very comprehensive and very sophisticated, but can be a little daunting themselves, almost creating the very problem they were designed to solve, which is, where do I start? With 20 critical security controls under CIS, that's a number most folks can wrap their head around. And furthermore, CIS is designed to interoperate with many of those other frameworks. So if you go after CIS initially and later decide, for example, you want a more comprehensive framework like NIST, you can apply all the controls you've already put in place towards that NIST framework, so that it's very much a stepping stone. You're not losing the energy and the effort you've already expended. They've actually been able to demonstrate by deploying just the top 5 controls, now of course that assumes you do it correctly, not just the checkbox approach, you can actually produce an 85% reduction in the efficacy of an attack against your organization just with those 5 controls. That's a pretty powerful statement and a pretty compelling reason to look at these frameworks.
According to the organization ISACA, IT enterprise security risk assessments are performed to allow organizations to assess, identify, and modify their overall security posture, and to enable security, operations, organizational management, and other personnel to collaborate and view the entire organization from an attacker's perspective. The assessment process helps organizations to efficiently and effectively implement their enterprise security solutions. Ron Temske commented on the approach that IT and business leaders need to take with a risk assessment.
It's really a classic approach to risk management. It's not even that unique to security. It just is so oftenly not applied. So it's a classic process of identifying the assets I'm trying to protect, and again, remembering that assets can be both intellectual or virtual in nature, as well as even things like brand and reputation. Identifying what is it that I'm trying to protect them from. So we go back to our conversation around confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and understand that an asset may have any permutation of those 3, including all of them. Who or what am I trying to protect it from? If I know, and this is hard for many organizations, you may not have visibility into who might be after those assets, identifying the value of them to the business, and very key that I do that in a consistent manner there, and then deploying security that's in alignment with that so that I'm having the proper level of spend aligned with the asset. What I don't want to do is spend $50,000 to protect an asset that has a value of $10,000 to the business. So I have to align that security spend to business need. So equally important to not overspending is also not underspending. I don't want to take a least common denominator approach to my environment and risk not protecting my most critical assets with the appropriate level of security that they need. This is why this business alignment is so important, so that I'm spending appropriately at all levels, not overspending for assets of lesser value, and spending properly for my most critical assets. Without that business alignment, that differentiated spending doesn't happen.
Despite good intentions and the best efforts of the team, some risk management programs may not in the end be 100% successful. Typical reasons can run the gamut from poor design and poor execution to poor communication and participation, to name just a few. Temske offered these thoughts on missed steps in enterprise risk management programs.
It's a couple things, and this applies to all risk management, not even just for security. One is that you have a scope of the project. These can drag on for years if you don't properly identify specific objectives you're looking to accomplish. Number 2 is recognize this has to have executive or board level sponsorship for it truly to be effective. And it can't be just an IT-driven initiative. This is a business risk conversation for which IT plays a critical role, but you have to have business stakeholders from all the areas that are in scope to understand properly what are the value of those business assets, what's the impact to the business if they were to be compromised. Frequently IT doesn't have that perspective, so this has to be kind of a multidisciplinary approach across the organization that combines business and IT. The other thing to recognize is that this is not a one-and-done activity. There may be an initial project, but this is something you have to reevaluate on a continual basis. Certain assets may have their value decreased over time. They're less critical to the business as time passes. Likewise, new lines of business may spin up, new assets may enter the business, and those values must be incorporated as well. So you have to recognize this is not a static document, but something that will change dynamically over time.
Guest expert Ron Temske spoke of yet another way to look at enterprise security by way of a threat-centric approach. This method tends to look at enterprise security from a malicious actor's point of view. Some think that this approach may even be easier to implement than its risk-based cousin. But is the threat-centric approach enough of a solution as a solo act? Let's listen in and find out.
So just as risk-centric was really looking at the business side, threat-centric is looking at the technology and, as the name implies, the actual threats. This is where we find most organizations focus on security because it's a little more comfortable for them. It looks at things like threat vectors, phishing, malvertising, right? What are the attacks that are actually happening in the wild? And so for many folks, it's a more comfortable area. And we look at it primarily in three areas: protecting ourselves from threats, helping detect when an attack is actually happening in our environment, and correcting or responding to those attacks when they do. So really, if you want to think of threat-centric as technology-focused, just as risk-centric was business-focused. Well, for organizations, really the reality is I think you have to do both. We have to align security with business, but there are also security risks that we know exist that I don't need to go through an exhaustive risk management exercise to identify. For example, I mentioned phishing before. We know phishing attacks are out there, and I know that I need to defend against them. I don't need to conduct a risk study to make that determination, right? So threat-centric really can focus on those attacks that we know we need to protect in all organizations without regard to business alignment. So the ultimate answer is I need to do both.
Long past waiting in the wings, cloud computing is now considered a mainstream technology that continues to wow the tech community. 65% of enterprises have now implemented some sort of a cloud solution, according to data from 451 Research. However, despite widespread acceptance of the cloud, some security concerns still remain. For example, in a LinkedIn survey of 300,000 of its members, some 53% indicated they had concerns about security and privacy in the cloud. So, with so much success, why are there lingering worries still out there?
Certainly the move to cloud security is a top reason organizations perhaps have delayed or have considered that move. And so a few things to think about. First is that you actually have more control of security in the cloud than many organizations think. There are many technologies that can be deployed in a cloud environment just as they can in your own data center, and so we see that overlooked. So number one is recognize you can maintain that ownership of your security in the cloud to a greater degree than you probably believe you can. As far as actually looking at the cloud providers themselves, what I tell organizations is there's just some fundamentals you have to think about. Know who you're doing business with. Look at how that cloud provider addresses security in their environment. Have they taken the initiative to go through various certifications or to comply with various measures like PCI, like HIPAA? There's many examples. Even if those don't apply to your business, they can be illustrative of whether that cloud provider is taking security seriously. And the last point I'd make there, and one that frequently gets overlooked, is knowing the relationship between your organization and the cloud provider. And what I mean by that is from a responsibility standpoint. For example, who owns doing backups in that environment? What happens if you lose that cloud provider? What are your rights to your data? What are the service level agreements as far as getting that data back to you? How will that happen? Is it on USB drive, right? How do you physically do that? Knowing those things going in will help your relationship with the cloud provider be much more effective and much smoother. And it's not necessarily that there are right or wrong answers there, but what's wrong is to make assumptions and find out after the fact that your assumptions were wrong. The last thing to look at is to really have visibility and understanding of what cloud applications are actually being used in your environment. Most people will be surprised how many cloud services are used without the organization's consent or knowledge. And there are tools that can help with that. One that's interesting right now is something called CASB, or Cloud Access Security Brokers, and they provide two fundamental features. One is giving you that visibility, so they'll help you understand whether it's Dropbox or Box.net or any myriad of cloud services that are being used. But more importantly, for the tools that you do authorize, it allows you to extend your security management directly from your environment into the cloud tools. So rather than having to use a separate set of tools offered by that cloud service provider, you can use the same tools you're using to manage your own environment and extend your internal policies to your cloud environment. So that can really make managing security in a hybrid cloud environment much easier.
It's said that best practices offer a method or technique that can lead to an effective course of action in order to solve a problem or deal with a challenging solution. Our guest expert, Ron Temske of Logicalis US, has more than 20 years of experience in the information technology consulting arena. Here, Ron offers us the benefit of that experience in the form of a top 10 list of best practices for enterprise security.
We could probably list 50 or more, but we'll stick to 10 for time's sake. And these are not necessarily in priority order, but we'll list 10 that we think are pretty important. So one would be having visibility to your traffic, both on your network, but also what's bypassing perimeter security. In fact, an analog of that is the idea of a perimeter is largely gone. With mobile workers, cloud service providers, this idea of a data perimeter, it doesn't really exist anymore. So having visibility into what's happening both on and off your network is key. Number two, we talked earlier about this idea of a security framework. I'm not going to say which one you have to pick, but having a security framework really is critical. Many organizations struggle with where to begin in security, and that framework can really help you. Number three is encrypting your data, whether it's on site or even more importantly in the cloud. There are many encryption technologies available today, both at rest and in motion, and they're relatively affordable, and certainly that provides a fairly high degree of protection for your data. We certainly recommend encryption. Number four is multi-factor authentication. The days when a password-only method of authentication could be secure are frankly just gone, and they're not coming back. So you have to look at more advanced ways of authenticating to the environment, and MFA, or multi-factor authentication, is certainly one of the most effective. And nowadays, with smartphone apps, it's so easy and inexpensive to implement these solutions. We kind of say there's no excuse for not doing it anymore. Next is taking a role-based authorization with least privilege applied, and so the concept of that is that we're providing access to the environment based on your role, and what least privilege means is you have the minimum amount of privilege to do what's necessary for your job. We see far too many organizations just giving individuals admin access because it's easy, and it is easy, right? Everything works when you're an admin, but also when you're compromised, everything breaks when you're an admin. So this idea of least privilege is very important. I generally don't talk about technology or products in here, but this is certainly one. If you're still running an older stateful inspection only firewall, it really is time to move to a next-gen firewall. And I'm not going to advertise one manufacturer over another, but there's too many capabilities provided in these solutions to not leverage them anymore. Number seven, having an incident response plan, and not just having a plan, but testing that plan on a regular basis, ensuring that when an attack really is happening, this is old hat, this is muscle memory, if you like that term. You've been through the drill, you know how to react, you know how to respond. Number eight is having a vulnerability management program. It's so key that we're applying the patches and the fixes that the manufacturers are providing for our systems. There's certainly no silver bullet in security, but it's pretty amazing how far just a solid vulnerability management program can do to protect you. For all the talk about zero-day attacks in the market, most attacks are not leveraging zero-day attacks. In other words, not leveraging attacks for which no patch is applied. They're leveraging vulnerabilities for which a fix is known, but they're preying on the fact that most customers haven't taken advantage and actually applied those patches. Number nine is looking at, this is kind of my term, what I call next generation anti-malware solutions. You also hear this called in the market as EDR, or endpoint detection and response. And the difference between this approach and a traditional signature-based is that these are solutions that look at behavior on the network rather than just signatures. You just can't keep up with signatures anymore. I saw a recent study showing that the number of malware variants released on per day is now up to 390,000. So there's just no way I can come up with that many signatures, but I can look at the behavior of those malware variants and stop it based on that. And so this move to more behavioral-based approaches. And then last but certainly not least is education and testing for your employees. I like to say that we're on Windows 10 desktop and Windows 2016 server, but still on the Human Operating System 1.0. And so we can't patch our employees, but we can certainly make them aware and educate them so they're a little smarter about maybe you don't click on that phishing link, maybe you don't go to that site that looks a little suspicious, and make sure we're including the human factor in security as well as the technology. So we certainly listed top 10 things you can look at, but the key is really look at the fundamentals first. We see too many organizations distracted by what I call shiny object syndrome and the latest technology that claims it's going to solve all your problems, but you really need to look at the fundamentals first. So have that framework in place, make sure you're covering the fundamentals, make sure you're addressing employee education, and start there before you get distracted by the latest gadgets.
The cyber threat landscape continues to become more and more challenging and complex. How will we protect businesses against advanced attack? What will it all mean for enterprise security? Ron Temske looks to the future.
So I think I have a few hopes there, and I think some of these are going to happen. One, I certainly hope that IoT becomes more secure. I jokingly refer to it as the Internet of Threats. IoT has tremendous business potential, but security has clearly been an afterthought there. So I certainly hope that the manufacturers of IoT technology start thinking about security incorporated into the device. I'm glad to see a trend that's already happening, which is organizations are taking security more seriously. But there's another aspect to that I'm thrilled to see, which is organizations leveraging security as a competitive differentiator. So not just protection, but actually looking at how their business can be stronger by the security technologies that they employ. And lastly, as from an industry perspective, something I think all security professionals have to do is recognize that we can't be seen as the folks who say no anymore, and that's been a reputation security's had for a long time. I like to use a phrase that security must be the enabler of yes, not the facilitator of no. And I liken it to a good legal organization. For all the jokes about legal services and that, a good legal team is worth their weight in gold. And the reason is it's not because they say no, it's because they say yes in a secure manner. And security is the same way, right? I commented about IoT. IoT is going to happen. We're not going to stop that. Our role as security professionals is to help IoT become secure, to say yes to IoT, but in a secure manner. And I think we have to think about security with that frame of reference in mind.
Temske closed with this final bit of advice.
So number one, don't panic. I say that a lot, but there's so much fear around security. It's important to move past the fear and just take a deep breath and take a rational approach to security. Number two is educate yourself and educate your employees. An educated workforce is a great defense against attackers. Recognize you may be a target of an attack. It certainly could happen. That doesn't mean you have to break the bank on tools. Those tools must be aligned to your business requirements. And if you keep that in mind, you'll have a rational, educated approach to defending yourself.
We'd like to thank Ron Temske, Vice President of Security Solutions for Logicalis US, for sharing his insights and understanding of the world of enterprise security. I'm your host, Mike Quinlan, and thank you for watching.